Mysterious disappearances of people as well as stories about parallel worlds will make any skeptic think that our world is clearly not as simple as it seems. So where do people disappear to? Today I'll tell you 4 stories told by real people from our reality who by chance still managed to visit another dimension. An unfamiliar street. The first story happened to a young man named Adam. That year was his senior year and he was going to college. He was spending the summer at his grandmother's place in the country, and he had a girlfriend left in town with whom he called from time to time. However, it was not easy as the cellular connection in the village was bad. The best cellular connection worked best on some elevated place, on the roof of a house or on a hill. The nearest hill was about a 10-minute walk from his grandmother's house. From that point, you could see the house perfectly, and the road was one and absolutely straight. In general, it was difficult to get lost here. One night before going to bed, Adam picked up his cell phone and went to call his girlfriend. He went, called, talked, and that was it. On the way back, Adam thought about something as he suddenly realized that he had been walking for a suspiciously long time. He looked around and suddenly realized that he didn't recognize this street at all. On the right side, he saw the river as it should be, but the buildings on the left side were completely unfamiliar to Adam. They were nice country houses, but not even close to what they should be. No matter how hard he looked at them, he couldn't recognize any of them. All the fences were close together, so there was no space between them for Adam to pass. He could only follow the main road. Adam kept walking, more and more perplexed and shocked by what was happening. He thought, "No matter how hard I go, I must have passed my house." He turned back in the opposite direction and was surprised to find he'd come back up the hill. From there he could see his grandmother's house at the bottom of the hill. There was still only one road heading toward the house, the same road he'd come down. Adam said later that it had taken him about 5 minutes to get back up the hill, even though he'd been walking the unfamiliar streets for nearly an hour. He carefully examined the familiar houses and set off again. This time he made it home without any trouble. What it was, of course, remained a mystery, but it was probably just a spatio-temporal glitch. I'd be happy to read your versions in the comments, but for now, let's move on. A funeral. The setting for this story is a village in Ukraine. This story is told by a girl who witnessed it. Here's what she said. "My grandmother and I came there to visit. The village was familiar to us. My grandmother's entire childhood was spent there. Well, and my great-grandmother she visited quite often. There's a cemetery in the village, but it's quite far from my great-grandmother's house. You have to take the bus to get there. There's a vacant lot that's not used for a vegetable garden or anything else. It's just a plot of land overgrown with weeds. Next to the vacant lot is the best well in the neighborhood. It's the best because the water there tastes better. Everyone in the neighborhood only takes water from there for cooking. One evening my grandmother went to the well to get water, and my great-grandmother and I stayed home. My grandmother didn't come back for a long time, so I decided to go to the well to look for her. To be honest, I wasn't afraid to go around the village at night. We often played in the dark with friends, especially since the houses had lighted windows, so it wasn't completely dark. But what I remember most about that night is that I was really scared. I remember my hands were covered in goosebumps when I went outside the fence. I thought every shadow was a monster, and I thought it was a special night, and that it was better not to leave the house. I don't know where it came from in my head, but I still remember those feelings and the words that echoed in my mind. I found my grandmother by the well. She was just standing there in silence, looking at the wasteland with a glassy stare. There were full buckets of water on the ground. I said to her, "Grandma, let's go home. Why are you standing here?" She replied that she was waiting for people to come back. I didn't understand anything and started dragging my grandmother by her dress. I was already afraid. I started to whimper and my grandmother finally followed me, but still reluctantly. I felt like I was dragging her by force, even though I was a small child and she was a rather massive woman. The buckets were left on the ground and I figured I could pick them up in the morning. Then, closer to our fence, it was as if Grandma suddenly came to her senses and walked on her own. The first thing she did was ask my great-grandmother for a drink. Although, as far as I remember, She was reluctant to drink alcohol, even on holidays, and would try to spill it at the first opportunity. That evening, she and my great-grandmother sat and talked for a long time. I did not understand everything, of course, but I was glad that we were all at home and that nothing threatened us. Grandma rushed out at dawn to get the buckets, but they were already gone. Maybe the neighbors had stolen them, although it was a bad custom there. In our village, things more expensive than buckets were left unattended without consequences. Well, my grandmother and great-grandmother bought new buckets, but the whole village turned around and tried to find the thief, but to no avail. Then years later, when I was older, I suddenly remembered that very incident and started asking my grandmother about it. She told me that that night she too was scared as soon as she stepped outside the fence. Then she heard something that sounded like church singing coming closer. And when she got some water and went home, she met a procession of people dressed in white. They were walking towards the wasteland. There were many of them, and they were all very scary, as Grandma put it. Two of them carried on their shoulders a coffin, also white, covered with a white cloth with gold embroidery. They went to the vacant lot, put the coffin on the ground, and began to sing together standing around it. She doesn't remember anything else until she was at our fence with me. What is interesting, the nearest death in the village happened only the next year, and it was a complete stranger and not even a neighbor. So it can't be considered a premonition. I think my grandmother somehow saw a parallel world. Well, such an interesting story told to us by a girl on the forum. It should be noted that in the villages of Russia and Ukraine, there is a huge number of similar stories, local legends, tales that actually represent a kind of supernatural folklore. Yes, people constantly faced and face something unknown, scary, and sometimes invisible. To believe in it or not is another question. A teleporting dog. There lived in one family a dog named Jack. Near the house of the owners of this wonderful animal was a public garden where dog owners at any time could go and walk their pets. More or less socialized dogs were let off leashes to run, play with each other, and all that. So Jack had every right to be considered the most socialized, so he successfully used this privilege. In one of such walks, the owner of the dog, a man, walked with Jack, took him on a leash and took him home. By the way, they live on the 7th floor, no balcony. The man's wife definitely saw Jack too because she washed his paws and went to put food on him. Both husband and wife saw the dog eat. After a while they wanted to call their pet, but he did not come running. For a long time they looked for the dog all over the apartment, but he was gone. Jack was nowhere to be found, although it would seem that where in the apartment can hide a healthy, cheerful, huge dog? After all, he couldn't have jumped out the ajar window on the 7th floor, just as he couldn't have gotten out through the door by locking it behind him with a key. The baffled couple went looking for Jack on the street. And guess what? They found him. Yes, in the same public garden. A familiar dog handler said he had been here for almost an hour, and the whole time Jack had been here too. To say that the owners were surprised is to say nothing at all. You could say that the man forgot the dog in the park and went home. But what about the fact that the wife washed the dog's paws and gave him food? And in general, those who are familiar with dog owners will realize that it would be strange for a dog owner to suddenly forget his dog on a walk. In general, the case is interesting, and most importantly, clearly unusual. An underwater teleporter. A story told by a guy named Alex. When Alex was very young, he traveled with his parents to a lake in Wyoming. That day, his dad taught him how to swim. For a while, the boy stayed splashing in the water near the shore, so that always in case of what could lean on the bottom. Once again, Alex failed to swim and tried to lean on the bottom. However, there was no bottom under his feet. He went underwater and then floundered for a long time trying to resurface. Everything was like a fog, whether from panic or something else, but the sensations were not pleasant. Finally, the boy managed to swim to the surface. What was his surprise? Because he surfaced on the opposite shore, which is about 650 feet. His parents, despite the fact that they had been around the whole time, they caught on as soon as he started screaming from the opposite shore. Neither Alex nor his mom and dad understood how it was that he, having barely learned to swim, was able to swim across an entire lake underwater in such a short time. As a variant here, we can consider the version with the child's guardian angel. In order to save the boy, the space-time continuum was changed. If you have something to add, dear friends, be sure to write it in the comments. Who liked this video, please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.